Hello, everybody. Welcome to Health and the Family week number 5. I'll apologize if I'm a little low energy today. The material for this week, I admit, I find it just a touch on the dry side, and also I'm not feeling that well physically. I don't know, I pulled a muscle in my back or something. It's really hurting me quite bad, so I apologize if I'm a little off today, but I'll try my hardest anyway. Let's see. I want to begin by focusing much more closely on work and the family in the context of well-being. Why don't I go ahead and bring up a whiteboard immediately? So this week, I want to focus much more closely on the topic of work and the family in the context of well-being. So we might begin by kind of taking each concept separately. That could be an approach, and just kind of unpacking each concept in relation to the chapters and articles that I have on the syllabus for this week, which again, you're not necessarily responsible for actually reading unless you decide to turn back and use some of those resources in your assignments. But and I'm not sure how much I'm going to dig into all of them today, because let's be honest, I posted way too many things for this week. I would not expect you to even come close to skimming even a few of these. There's just way too many of them. If you feel that you need some of these resources, go back and pull them in. But there's a surplus of resources for this week. So keep that in mind. I listed quite a few chapters. Obviously, we can't cover them all in detail. Chapters 6, 8, 9, and 10, and a supplemental article from a journal, the Journal of Marriage and the Family, titled "The Impact of the Family on Health," which is a dated article from the 1990s. Well, why do I bring in these articles? Just to provide some sort of an orientation. It's not that I'm not concerned with the facts and evidence-based scholarship. I know that's a really hip word today. Let's see how hip it is in 20 years. But right now, it's a really hip word. It's not that I'm not in favor of that. I certainly am using the data, the statistics, to help guide the theory. But ultimately, I don't want to get hung up on the facts too much, on these facts too much. They're there as a way of anchoring together our thoughts. But I don't want to get so focused on the precision of the statistics and so on that we lose the thinking, the orientation, the theory about what this means in the broader context and what it could mean for the future and so on. So let's begin then with the definition of health. I should really switch to the other side so that you're not endlessly hearing the squeaking of my sofa, but I'll do that the next video if I can remember. Well, we've already made some steps, I think, in defining this concept of health in previous classes. I told you up front that I'm in favor of a sociological definition of health, and that's really important. It's so important that I want to write it right here. Like as a provocative question, what is a explicitly sociological definition of health? That's a key question. And it's not as easy to answer as you may immediately or spontaneously think. In the American context, which I seem to be railing on in every one of my classes lately, maybe it's because I spent such a lot of time in recent years outside of the American context that now I have some sort of objectivity about the ongoings of the American context that appears quite often as critical commentary, for which I apologize. But in the American continent, we tend not to think of health, and I'm talking explicitly within sociology courses, we tend not to think of health strictly in a sociological sense, but rather as a biological. Maybe it's worth kind of drawing this out a little bit so we can map our thoughts. We tend to think about it in its biological dimension. What else would that include? It's related, I guess, to the medical definition or a medical definition of health. We tend to think about it in its psychological dimension, and often what passes as critical scholarship is to say, well, health is not just biological, it's also mental. And indeed, that is a bit of a critical form of scholarship to include that psychological element, but it's not it's certainly not everything. Uh, so, we can think about it in these ways. And if we were to encase these definitions of health within a sociological orientation, we might even talk about the fact that there are social determinants of health. And this is a very fancy buzzword that we hear a lot of. Let's say the social determinants of health. And, these social determinants of health precede the biological, psychological, or medical consequences of our well-being. So in other words, the social determinants of health, SDOH, if you want to write it in shorthand, the SDOH, the social determinants of health, are the sort of social structural determinations that give rise to these various health outcomes that we suffer in our everyday lives, in our personal lives as individuals and as communities and so on. And in many cases, that's where we tend to stick within the sociology of health, within the sociology of the family, within and so on and so on. Whenever the issue of health comes up, we tend to fall back to a biological, medical, or psychological definition of health in terms of outcomes, but we merely encase it with a sociological sense of determination. So, I don't know, let's say lung cancer. Lung cancer, I might suffer it individually, but what are the social determinants of lung cancer? Well, perhaps there's factories, and there's economic reasons why there's factories, and political reasons why there's factories, and perhaps smoking advertisements have conditioned us to want to smoke. And we can come up with any number of sociological determinations for these health consequences. And that's one approach that indeed we do take within, let's say, the sociology of health more particularly. So we tend to speak of the sociological or the social determinations of health, but rarely have we ever taken a sociological definition of health in of itself. When we talk about our health, it's one thing to situate it within sociological determinations and say our health is still biologically, medically, and psychologically defined, but we just merely come up with sociological determinations that give rise to these biological issues that we suffer from in our everyday lives or at a particular moment in our life and so on. So, but it's quite different to say, well, can we come up with an actual explicit definition of health that is sociological, that is not therefore reducible purely to a biological conception of what constitutes health or well-being, that's not purely reducible to a medical or a psychological definition as to what constitutes well-being. Now, it's an abstract idea, and in some sense, because it's so foreign to us, I'm sure we tend to think about it as an armchair, a sort of a merely theoretical issue, and yet it's not. It has real practical consequences in our everyday lives if we can tease out a sociological definition of health that is irreducible to the, let's say, dominant conceptions of health that we have today, which tend to be biological. When you think of health, you think about your body, typically, right? As a biological organism. Well, let's begin, or I guess we've already begun, haven't we? Let's, instead of beginning, let's continue by having a look at the World Health Organization as a sort of global, we might say, because the word world is in there. It's a question of if it actually serves global definitions of health, and that's a whole debate we could have in another course and perhaps in another time. But the World Health Organization, the WHO, which is, a very important power in the world today, if only a discursive power, as we know because of the pandemic. What sort of a definition of health do they have? Well, if you go to their the World Health Organization website, and maybe I'll even do that for you in real time. I don't see a reason why we shouldn't. Let's see if I can find it. I hope I can find it for you. Oh, I'm not sharing my screen. Forgive me for a moment. I got to share the screen. Google Chrome. Here we go. So here's the World Health Organization. And if you go on their website and you look for, I don't know if I'm at the right spot. Oh, here, how about here? About us. Yikes, I lost it. Oh, I'm sorry. I keep pushing the button at the exact moment that it comes up because my internet is so slow. Forgive me. Okay, you go to the About Us section. And where would it be? Probably in who we are. It might be in what we do, but I think it's in who we are. Aha, Constitution. The Constitution of the World Health Organization. Who are they? That's such a lame joke. Who are the WHO? Well, this is a constitution, reads a bit like a manifesto, but it's not a manifesto. At the very beginning, we get a definition. I would call this the cornerstone of the entire document. And it's an interesting definition because not all cultures in the world would agree with this definition, but it does intend to be inclusive of a multicultural perspective on health and well-being. It intends that. That's certain. It says, health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. Okay, so let's try and unpack it just a little bit. First off, you notice they're referring to physical as well as mental. That seems important. So you have physical and mental, and they have social in there as well. And I think that's an extremely important addition. It gives room to the sociological, the exclusive domain of a sociological conception of health. It means that we're permitted in some sense to think of ourselves as having a unique vantage point on well-being that can only be arrived at from within a social perspective, a sociological. Can there be social well-being, for example, that is different from, yet intersects with physical and mental well-being, is the question I'm trying to ask. And my answer is, of course, yes, I believe that there is. Well, first, at the very beginning, you can sense that also there's a holistic, but not in the sense, there's a sense of a holistic point of view. It's there in the word complete, physical, mental, and social. It's holistic in a certain sense, but not in the sense that we use the word holistic that as we've been using it in this course in the sociological context, in particular of sociological family systems theory. Forgive me, I need a drink. Choking on my own words. Okay, well, that's interesting, but in sociology, at least within this course, and we've extracted this from some actual textbooks where we have leading thinkers who are trying to be representative of particular traditions of thought, guiding us. So we're not entirely off our rocker when we make this claim. Holistic in our definition is we mean it in terms of balancing all scales of analysis. I feel like I should break out here for a moment and go to a whiteboard. So in what sense do we mean holistic? I mean, we've already gone over it, but I'm going to do it again. A sociological version of the word holistic, which is in contrast perhaps to the World Health Organization and to many other versions of the word holistic. What we mean is that we're trying to think of health in terms of across many scales of analysis, right? Maybe I'll say analyses in the plural, but what does that mean? It means, for example, we should think about it in terms of micrological, mesological, and macrological scales of analysis minimally. whereby micrological means the interactions that are and the roles we perform in a sort of symbolic interactionist worldview or perspective. Mesological, we're looking at institutions such as the university, such as the family. These are sociological institutions, such as the healthcare system, the churches, and so on, or religious temples. Macrological in terms of big abstract social structures, such as we might say ideology or culture as a singular sort of macrological. We might say American culture, for example, as a macrological structure versus South Asian culture, for example. So that's one way that we're thinking holistically, by thinking across these various scales of analysis, as they do in the family ecosystems perspective, where we have systems within systems. So, for example, we have the family existing within an institute, a large interactions within the family existing within a larger institutional context, also within a larger cultural context, for just as one example. So these are all kind of interdependent here. So we're thinking across all these systems. We have systems of systems. On the other hand, capitalism might be another macrological system. So that's one way that we're thinking holistically. Another way that we're thinking holistically is also that we're thinking of health in terms of variations in space and time, which is a point I've been trying to get through. It's kind of a new point that I've been exploring recently in my own sociological thinking, and I see a great utility to it. Even in its simplicity, it seems to be helping us in certain ways, or helping me in certain ways, and hopefully you'll see some sort of utility, even though it's very abstract at the same time. The abstraction is a part of its precision. The price you pay for precision is abstraction. And I know that sounds really paradoxical, but the more general a statement, the more applicable it is to a wide variety of cases, the more abstract that statement must be in some sense. That comes from a German philosopher named Hegel. The concrete is embedded within the abstract for Hegel, but we'll put the philosophy to the side. So we're thinking in terms of variations in space and time. And we saw the importance of this approach, for example, in the life course perspective. In the life course perspective, we're looking at the health of people at a particular stage of their life, but also at other stages of their life, as children and as adults, and so on. So that's how we tend to mean holistic in sociology, or at least that's one approach to thinking holism in sociology. That's different than the World Health Organization definition of holism, which includes thinking across these three domains minimally. Second, the World Health Organization definition focuses on physical, which means biological, focuses on mental, which means broadly psychological, and focuses on, and I like that they add this, it's very special and important for us. So special. It's social, which implies sociological, or we might say cultural as well. I don't see why not. The social can include religious and so on. But the point is there's something of the social well-being that should be thought of in terms of the holistic perspective as well. So we're trying merely to satisfy this third one from the World Health Organization. And for the World Health Organization, their sense of holism, remember, has something to do with the interactions between all three of these positions, and not just one. We're trying to think exclusively in terms of one to do our part to some extent, which doesn't mean we want to totally bracket these out, but we want to give priority and preference to the sociological because we are sociologists, at least provisionally. If one suffers socially, I guess I'll just leave it where we are right now. If one suffers socially, what does that mean to suffer socially? suffer socially, it means in some sense we're suffering from inadequate social bonds, inadequate social interactions, inadequate social regulation, perhaps. We're suffering somehow in terms of our social relationships, in terms of our place within the social, perhaps. And so that seems really important to me. It could have an impact on our well-being in terms of our individual psychology as well, no doubt about it. Or let us say that if one suffers depression, as an example, which is psychological, let's presume for the moment that depression is a strictly psychological problem. I'm not convinced that it is. And if we had more time and another class, I could tell you why. Partly because I'm a sociologist, I like to think of depression sociologically. And a psychoanalyst doesn't necessarily think of depression in the way that you would imagine either. They tend to be much more sociological in their orientation of thinking about depression. But depression, which is psychological, it could have an impact on our social well-being. So we're going to use this as an example, depression. Okay, let's presume that it is, strictly speaking, psychological or a mental issue of health. It has nonetheless, or it could have nonetheless, some sort of social or sociological implications. In what sense? It could have an impact on our social well-being, perhaps by keeping us from connecting with other people in meaningful and enduring social relationships. Let's just put it really naively. Let's say depression keeps us in bed. It's not necessarily what depression always does, okay? But just to keep it simple as an example, well, if we're staying in bed, we're not going out and forming social bonds with other people. We're not roped in. We're not tied into the social glue, to the social bond. And so we suffer at the level of our social relationships, which would be over here. If we're not in a state of physical health, so let's say we're suffering somehow physiologically or biologically, physiologically might be more accurate, that could also have some sociological implications, and vice versa, right? So that's what it means to think a bit holistically. Having physiological health issues could cause mental health issues. That could even cause depression. Or let's say I'm very lonely. I'm suffering at the level of my social relationships because I don't have any. If I don't have any social relationships, you can see why that might lead one toward psychological ill health. In other words, perhaps depression or something like that. Again, I'm just using these examples naively just to demonstrate the way in which these components all must be thought kind of together in some sense, even while we think of them each independent of one another. So although we adopt this sort of, there you are. Hi. Although we adopt this holistic sense of well-being and sociology, in the sense that we do sometimes bring physiological or biological and mental or psychological aspects of our well-being into the mix, we do nonetheless, and I think it's extremely important that we overcompensate in this area today because it seems to be underrepresented. This would be my provocation. We do nonetheless try to demonstrate that all of this occurs within a wider domain of the social bond, of the social group, and that there's some sort of sense of social determination here, social determinations of family health or of health, but also health as a social concept, which is not necessarily the same thing, but should nonetheless be treated as the same thing. So what is an exclusively sociological definition of health? I think, and I'm just kind of working my way toward it with all of you as I move through the material with you, I think, let's consider it a bit of our innovation, although it is tied to some tradition, it concerns the quality of our social bonds in space and time. I know some of you are thinking we should be at the bar. I don't know if those of you who do drink, I don't drink, but those of you who do, you probably imagine sometimes in the discussions in your sociology courses, it's like you're at the bar and you're like, yeah, man, what if we think this way? But just try and think in this different sort of perspective to see where it could lead. Health concerns the quality, in some sense, of our social bonds in space and time. And it's a point I've been trying to thread through the course a little bit here and there by repeating it. When we speak of the social, it seems important. So it's possible then to not only speak of the social determinations of health, SDOH. In other words, let's put it like this: social determinations. I gotta be careful how I spell and what I write. I noticed in my other class I wrote problem instead of promise on the board one time. Anyway, social determinations of what? Of health. But we also have a sort of social version of health. Which could also be its own type of determination. In other words, we can think of health, strictly speaking, as social and not simply a consequence of the social. And so that's where I'd like to go. And I'm not sure I can convince you all to follow me along in that journey. So I can only do so much within the context of its reception. But let's see a little bit of where I'm coming from, just so you don't think I'm a total nut job, and maybe let's not rule out the fact. Let's not reject the hypothesis that your professor's a nut job. But let's look at, for example, Emile Durkheim, founding figure of sociology. Emile Durkheim, who I hope you've heard of. It's okay if you haven't. You'll get a little bit from it today, but I mean, you really should have, if you're in this course by now, at least heard of Emile Durkheim, even if you don't remember everything about him, because some would say he's responsible for founding sociology as an academic discipline. And it's a question of how he did that. In some sense, you could say by speaking about the social determinations of health, the social determinants of health. Well, what's the difference again in these two positions that I've been outlining? Well, the social determinants of health does not in of itself take health to mean something that is in of itself sociological. It doesn't by necessity take the concept of health as a social concept. It can, sometimes it does, it often doesn't. It still treats health as a biological, medical, psychological, for example, exclusive domain that's merely an effect of prior sociological determinants or determinations. So that's all it's suggesting. On the other hand, to adopt the sociological concept of health, which is the ongoing question, it's also to claim that health is a social fact. There's a facticity to the concept of health in terms of what its social aspect. It's a social fact. It's not simply a biological response or consequence, although it may be that too. But it can also be studied independent of biology, independent of psychology, independent of philosophy, where you speculate, what is death? What is the being of death? Does death have a being? It's independent of this sort of stuff. Our definition of health can have something to do with the relative healthiness or well-being of a social bond, of the connections between people in a society. Thus, for example, if we were to be innovative, as I think we should be, we could reinterpret one of Emile Durkheim's important points on what we today would call the social determinants of health, which is his discussion of the concept suicide, which I'm sure some of you are already familiar with. If you're not, hear me out. You're going to hear it for the first time. I imagine a good chunk of you already know what Durkheim had to say about suicide, but if you haven't, it's fine. I'm going to give you a quick, no-nonsense sort of tour of it, and it really will be quick because I just want to make a point, which is somewhat of a provocation, because you are the future of perhaps sociological thinking, perhaps not necessarily sociological thinking, but it would be nice to see in the future people think of health, strictly speaking, sociologically, to see what we can do with that and where it moves us. For Durkheim, he was trying to ground a new discipline of sociology within the university. Of course, to do so, he needed to demonstrate that it had a unique subject matter, unlike the subject matter of biology, unlike the subject matter of, let's say, medicine, unlike the subject matter of psychology, unlike the subject matter of philosophy, and so on and so on. So it needed to demonstrate it had a unique subject matter. So what Durkheim wanted to do was to think about suicide, which is a health concern. He wanted to think about it as what he called a social fact. Suicide has something to do with social facts, the facticity of something to do with the social and social bonds and social beings. Again, very abstract for now, but hopefully you'll get to the point of figuring out what this means if you don't already. So what is the unique subject matter for Durkheim? The unique subject matter of sociology are the study of social facts. Sociology, he claimed, must study social facts. That's the exclusive domain of sociology. That's what it brings that no other discipline can bring to the table. That's what makes it a unique sociological account, is to focus on what he called social facts. And of course, he claimed that a social fact could help us understand something of the study of social facts, could help us understand something of this type of, we might say, ill health known as the act of suicide or suicidal ideation. But ultimately, we're dealing with the act of suicide in Durkheim's case, and not simply the idea of wanting to commit suicide. Although I feel like to some extent we could bring those two together if we want. I don't see a reason why to necessarily separate them. So what is a social fact? Well, for Durkheim, a social fact is an independent, external, coercive force upon the individual. This definition is not as good as we like to think it is when it's repeated, but it does serve a purpose. And it's true that Durkheim wrote this, but I'm not sure it's as clear as what he wrote. If you read the rest of his work, you realize it's actually much more complicated than simply being independent and external and coercive. Okay, it's independent. A social fact is anything that's independent of our consciousness, independent of our thinking it, external to our free will, in the sense that it's coercive because it determines us to act in particular ways, whether we think we're in control of acting the way we want or not. It's a bit like what Freud called the unconscious. It's like we have this knowledge, these ideas, these ways of acting and behaving that determine us, but we think that they don't. So there's this sort of repository of behaviors and ideas that kind of propel us into the world, whether we're aware of them or not. So you can think however you want, but society is kind of forcing you to think in these ways, forcing you to act in the world in these particular ways, whether you like it or not. It's independent of you, it's external of you, but it coerces you. It determines you. It's a social determinant. A social fact in this way is a social determinant of our behaviors. So what Durkheim did here was he thought of suicide in relation to social facts. What does that imply? It implies that you must study suicide as something that exists independent of our thinking about it. In other words, we're not the agents of our own suicide necessarily. It's not that simple, according to Durkheim. Uh, it's independent of individuals as such. So we study it always in relationship to other social facts. So sociology for Durkheim is the study of social facts in relation to other social facts. We never bring it down to the individual. We're simply talking in terms of these social facts in relation to other social facts. So if we were to sort of draw it out, you would say, okay, well, society consists of all these social facts. We might have social fact 1, social fact 2, social fact 3. And if we want to understand the society, and then we have sort of individuals out here. If we want to understand the way society works, we're studying the social facts themselves and not the individuals. So we don't care what the individual's necessarily thinking. We're not concerned with suicide as a chemical imbalance in a psychological perspective. Not that that's a psychological perspective at all. We're not concerned with suicide in terms of a philosophical definition, like what is suicide? We're not concerned with the biology of suicide, how the body decomposes and what sort of neurons are, I don't know. We're trying to study just social facts, and we're abstracting from the individual, kind of saying, okay, let's not think about the individual here per se. We're thinking about these rudimentary elements of society that we call social facts that are independent and external and coercive of the individual. So we study always in relation to other social facts. What does this ultimately mean for the study of suicide? And here we're still talking about Durkheim. Well, for Durkheim, he said, well, suicide, if it's a social fact, we study it in relation to other social facts. Let's study it in relation to social integration as one social fact. And let's study it in relation to social regulation as another social fact. So we have 3 social facts then. We have social integration, social regulation, and suicide. So we're studying social facts in relation to one another, and these are the social facts that he chose. Well, what does it mean? Well, it is a fact, independent of me. It's a fact that societies can be more or less integrated, right? You can have more intense or intimate or stronger bonds with people or less. That's a fact. And different societies have more. And even within society, different, like for example, look at Toronto. There's probably many more interactions happening there at a given time, which we should be aware of in the context of a pandemic, than there are in North Bay, where there's far fewer and frequent interactions on a daily basis, right? So we would say social integration is a little different in both of these domains, in both of these places. Or if you think about Canada in relation to, I think about in relation to India. There's way more social interactions, and the social bond, the interactions, they have more integrity in India, in the sense that, you're probably in many cases living with your family from the time you're born until even after you're married in some cases. So there's an intensity to the social bond there that in Canada, there's, a lot of people leave the home around 17, 18. It's less integrated. So we could say it's a social fact that societies are more or less integrated. So we can say less with a minus, or maybe more integrated with a plus. And this is kind of, it occurs on like a scale. You could have more or less integration in a society, and that's a social fact. On the other hand, a society can be more or less regulated. It's a fact that societies have more or less rules. So take, for example, the idea that there is plus would mean more regulation, and minus would mean less regulation. You can exist in a scale here of more or less regulation. It is a fact that societies have more or less regulation. Like some societies are more, we might say, tyrannical in that there is just absolute obedience to all these rules or something like that. Other societies have far fewer rules, fewer policies set, for example, or more ambiguous policy. So there's much less regulation. It's a fact that you can feel more or less regulated within a society. And you can think of this across all kinds of different scales. Like maybe in the home you feel more regulated, but in the university you feel less. Or maybe in the university you feel more regulated, but out in the streets you feel less regulated. Okay, so we have these social facts of social regulation, social integration. What can it tell us about suicide? And I'm getting to a larger point at the end of this. What it tells us is that suicide as a social category of health, a particular type of health, depends upon how we are situated across these other social facts. If we're too integrated in a society, for example, if you have too much integration, then what you can suffer from is a type of suicide that he called altruistic. You lose yourself. You lose yourself in the crowd, in your society. In a sense, there's no sense of self at all. You are that society. You're so connected to the society that you give your life to the society. That's altruism, selflessness, you might say, in a strict sense of selfless, to not have a self. You are suffering here precisely because you're too connected to you're too intensely or too bonded to people in your society. And that's one type of suicide that Durkheim discovered. And he had all kinds of empirical data to support that this happens when we go off balance and we end up too integrated or not integrated enough, or too regulated or not regulated enough. So let's see, social disintegration or not being integrated enough. For example, you end up with a type of suicide that he called egoistic. You feel so much away from the social group, so disconnected from the social group. Durkheim thought Protestants suffered from this type of suicide more than any other because of a lack of rituals, and they celebrate individual thought and inquiry and so on. Egoistic suicide. This is a type of ill health that has to do with it's egoistic in the sense that you have such an inflated sense of self because there's no other people in your purview. It's just you. You're separated. You're so separated. You want to not be separated. That's the cause of your suffering. And that's egoistic suicide. Okay, let's look at the scale of regulation. For regulation, we can have what he called fatalistic suicide, which is a type of ill health where you feel so controlled by all the rules. What reason is there to live? There's no freedom. Freedom in terms of free will, not in terms of freedom from being integrated, where you're not up against a rule. So that's a type of suicide. I'm just kind of quickly glossing this at this point. And if I'm going too fast, which I presume I am for some of you, thank God you have a video, because what you can do is pause at any moment and go back and listen and try and work it out a little bit more and pause and so on. What's the last one? Anomic. He called this anomic. That's where there's no, think of it as a synonym for anarchy or something like that. There's no regulation at all. In a society where there's no regulation at all, you suffer from having too much freedom. Some people would claim my classrooms are sometimes like that. Maybe not this one, but if we were in a live seminar, it's an anomic freedom, which causes a certain surplus of anxiety, because when there's anomie, an anomic type of regulation, which means no regulation at all, you're suffering because people can say and do whatever they want. What's the point of it? When you have that level of freedom, you can go and kill another person, if only with your voice, by overpowering them. There's no way to say, stop that, let another person have a turn, or don't steal that person's property or something like that. So you can see then from this that we get a really nice schema for understanding suffering. In this case, four different types of suicide. And he had the empirical stats to back this up. It wasn't simply a theory. The thing you really want according to Durkheim here, is to be sort of balanced, to be somewhere here in the middle, not to be too much over here, not to be too much up here, over here, down here, but somewhere in the middle where there's well-being or health in a sense. So, if we just abstract from this even more, Durkheim's functionalist perspective was that societies are best when they're not too disintegrated, not too integrated, not too regulated, not too deregulated. It's a notion of balance. It's another way of thinking about being holistic. If we forget for a moment of the concept of suicide, and just think about this generally in terms of health, I think it offers a wonderful model of a sociological concept of health. How regulated are we in space and time? How regulated are our interactions in space and time? Too much or too little? Too few regulations. How integrated are we in space and time? Is it too much or not enough? And depending upon where we fall on that spectrum as a society, as individuals within that society who are interacting within a social bond, we suffer the repercussions in terms of a sociological concept of health. It threatens the social bond itself, but it also threatens members of the social bond, which can have biological, physical, and psychological ramifications, of course. So what we're saying then is that health seems to be, for Durkheim, about balancing the social facts of integration and regulation at the level of our social bond. That would be a provisional definition anyway, and I think it's a really quite remarkable definition of health. Or well-being. I actually like the word well-being here a little bit more, but even that one I have problems with, but I won't burden you with that. A social bond is healthy, that is, it is in some harmony or balance when interactions that occur in space and time are neither too intense nor too regulated, neither too deregulated nor too disintegrated or delinked. That, I think, is a step in the direction of understanding a specifically sociological definition of health. And from that, we can deduce perhaps a sociological definition of family health, and not merely or not exclusively the social determinants of family health. How regulated is the family? How integrated is the family? I wasn't intending to do this. Let's consider this just a quick tangent. But like in the old psychoanalytic perspective, which we've talked about in this course a little bit. So let's kind of I'm risking a lot here by bringing out this degree of abstraction on all of you, but it is an upper year course. I'm not expecting you to fully understand everything, but if you have the courage to try and think through this, how can we think about this from the psychoanalytic perspective, or maybe even the symbolic interactionist perspective? To some degree, but probably more the psychoanalytic. What we have here is what in the psychoanalytic tradition, we would say, this is the axis of the father, the traditional father role, the classical conception of the family, which of course we problematize today. I mean, I'm not saying this is the way it ought to be, but the person who served on the axis of social regulation or social deregulation, fathers, the law of the father, we might say the rules of the father and the traditional conception of the family. This is how it was conceived in psychoanalysis. And over here we have the axis of the mother, of caring, of integrating the child. Is it too much integration, or not enough? Is the mother close to the child or far from the child? Does the father separate, in some sense, the child from the mother to some degree, which would be the Oedipal drama? So there's a lot of ways we could go with this, and I see the way in which this perspective can be scaled micrologically, mesologically, macrologically. I see how we can see it in terms of the interactions at the level of any one of these scales, such as the micrological interactions within the family system itself, between the various roles that we take. You know, in the contemporary schema, we might even go, again, I'm riffing here. I'm totally off script. So I apologize again if it's a little too abstract for some of you, as it no doubt is. But we might even say that the same parent figure in some ways could satisfy both of these. It doesn't have to be a gendered parent. But let's enough with the crazy abstractions for a little while. let's look at the social determinants of family health. I'm not sure how long we've been going so far. I felt like I spent way more time there than I intended. But if we're talking about the social determinants of family health, I want to begin here. We're back to the social determinants of health perspective, and not necessarily centrally a sociological conception of health itself, although we can certainly think in that way if we want as well. Well, let's take a structuralist analogy for thinking about family health. Let's take an analogy to make sense of the social determinants of family health or well-being. Whereas health, from a sociological point of view, does not only mean biological and or psychological health, but also has everything to do with the health of our social relationships, the integrity of our social relationships and our social systems and our social institutions, and the well-being that we experience in relation to others in society. It nonetheless does not include or doesn't exclude the biological and psychological definitions of health from our purview. We still want to have some sense of that stuff, right? Even though it's not what we're good at sociologists. The question that's asked in one of the texts for this week is, how does the family affect the health of its members? I think it's a naive question. Because it seems to ignore the social determinants of health again. It's just the family's affecting the health of its members. Well, what about the family of the family? Our family members also came from a family, and they're also situated within a social system, for example. So we can't ignore that dimension. We can't ignore the social determinants of health because it doesn't ignore us. The author writes, I'm quoting, "It is in the family that the macro level social and economic order affects individuals' physical and emotional well-being," end quote. Good. That's a nice structuralist or sociological or even quasi-systems theory approach to thinking about family health that points us in the right direction. And he's writing in the 1990s, so I think it's doing pretty good. How can members of a family get sick within that family system? We're exploring an analogy for the social determinants of health here a little bit. One answer is that it's a really naive example, okay? So hear me out. This is a really naive example. One answer might be, well, it's contagion. That's how members of the family end up getting sick. It's from some sort of type of contagion. Think of this as an analogy, okay? Perhaps a member of the family infects you as another member of that family with something. That's a possibility. But the question is, where did that infection come from? Well, if we follow the analogy, and that's how I want it to be thought, strictly as an analogy, then the members of the family are infected by another family member who's brought that infection into the family system from outside. It came from outside. So it was once outside the family, and then it was brought into the family. Perhaps I'm in my family home, and then I leave the home and I go and get some groceries. Maybe I forgot to bring my mask. Maybe I forgot to even put it on. I certainly hope that's not the case. It's just an example. And I come home, and before I know it, within 3 days, not only am I sick, but all of my family members are sick. The infection was transmitted from without into. This analogy, I don't think it's a perfect one, obviously, but it does help us understand what social determinants of health means to some extent. The causation is outside the family system. That's what it means to be determined from outside. The cause comes from outside. So mental and physiological issues are, in some sense, in this analogy, transmitted from somewhere outside the family into the family. The easiest way to think about it by drawing it, as if I need to simplify it any further, but maybe doesn't, I don't know. Here's the family, and the family maybe has a few different family members. There's one, there's two. We'll say there's two family members here in this conception, child and one parent. And they exist within a larger social system, and perhaps many. Maybe there's overlaying ones here, but I'm not going to go there. I'm going to just keep it relatively simple. So we have sort of here a family system with elements, which is the child and the parent. And then we have, say, wider social system, which is encompassing of the family. Well, the contagion then came from without. And from without, it infected within. That's an SDOH, social determinants of health kind of perspective, in a sense. In other words, what we're trying to do here is take a systems perspective and imagine that members of the family are inheriting, in some sense, the illnesses that exist in their external environment. It's a certain presupposition that psychoanalysis shares with systems theory, with let's say, a broader sociological perspective. There's something about the interactions within the family system, within the various roles of that family system, parent and child in this case, that transmits the illness at a more micrological perspective. We might say a symbolic interactionist perspective might help us at that level. And, the functionalist perspective would add that it's within the family that some functional health or harmony is maintained. There ought to be some balance. The conflict perspective and the psychoanalytic perspective might add, I hope you remember, that the balance is a bit of a lie and a deception. We were never fully in a state of health anyway, to a greater or lesser degree. And that, remember, the family, this is the psychoanalytic perspective, but we also saw it in the work of Zygmunt Bauman. So I'm going to write his name here one more time. That the family as an institution is also a life strategy. It doesn't only inherit the specter of death through contagion, through infection. It's not only inheriting it, but it's dealing with it as a system, as a bubble. As a bubble, these institutions, like the family, I like that I threw the word bubble in there. I'm kind of proud of myself. Anyway, as a bubble, they exist as a life strategy, what Zygmunt Bauman calls a life strategy, to deal with or avoid, but mostly deal with the consequences of ill health, of suffering, and ultimately of death. That's Bauman's position as a sociologist that aligns us with the psychoanalytic perspective, that the whole goal of all social institutions, all social systems, and that includes the family, is to ward off the specter of death. Well, is that what is happening? It sounds so abstract, but look, if you look at the empirical data, it certainly bolsters this point of view. And I'll give you some of that data. I'll give it to you in just a moment. The stats indicate clearly, if we look at mortality rates, let's just take the example of mortality rates. And here we're going to get more empirical and move away from the theory a little bit. Mortality rates seems very important. These mortality rates here, it seems very important. So, oh my God, I'm sorry, everybody. I'm embarrassed right now. Let's take a look at the Statistics Canada both definitions of the family, but some statistics to see if our theory that we've outlined up until now holds up to any extent. And in some sense, we've built this theory ourselves. I don't know if you're aware of it. We, as a social group, me in relation to the text, but also students in this course who are emailing me and so on, This is something we're kind of building together to get an understanding of a uniquely sociological account of health in the family. Um, what's the government definition of, we have a government definition of health, well, World Health Organization definition of health, which isn't necessarily government, but what's the government definition of the family? The Canadian census defines the family in terms of what they call a census family. The census family is, I'm not sure I should write this. It might take more time than what's required. I guess I will. A census family is defined as a married couple with or without children of either or both spouses. So I'll put a comma here. A common law couple with or without children of either and or both partners, or alone. I almost wanted to write alone, all one word. I guess it's the same thing. A lone parent of any marital status with at least one child. Okay, so there's got to be at least two people. We see that. This is the definition of a census family. Of course, it's broken up a little bit more. I want to be clear, and it's adopted more of a progressive definition of the family. It's not necessarily what we would call a liquid family, what we've been calling, I think, a liquid family, which is a family that has multiplicitous definitions, but it's pretty close to that. For example, they write a couple may be of opposite sex or same sex. They're not talking gender, they're saying sex. They use the word actual sex, not gender, which is interesting. A couple family with, well, they further classify it more and more. I don't want to get into all the details because it's distracting us a little bit from the overall point. And they say step families count, and they qualify what a step family is. It seems to me that a child is somewhat essential in the sense that you can't just be one person to be a census family by this definition unless you have a child. There needs to be at least two. So I'm monitoring time because I'm realizing how much time I've taken so far, so I'm jumping over some things that I was going to say. I should add that this definition, of course, doesn't include, let's say, when we're talking about a census family, we're not talking about, for example, what we might call a postmodern family, which is actually a word I hear a lot in the sociology of family world. The postmodern family means what Bowman calls a liquid family, but even more. What Bowman's calling a liquid family is the changing nature of the family. It has something more to do with the fact of what's happening to the family. A postmodern family, it seems there's a wide range of definitions of what the postmodern perspective on defining the family is, but basically, it's a family is anything. It can be you and a rock that you drew a face on. It can be you and a pet. And we often say that I have a cat and we are a family. I don't have a cat. I wish I did. It can be any number of things. You and a friend who live together, we're a family. That's the postmodern conception of a family, but we're speaking more in terms of a sociological definition of the family, which I'm not sure we fully defined ourselves yet, but also in terms of a census family. But it's good to be aware of, the fact that we could be defining family in any number of ways. So let's look at some quick Canadian statistics because we're focused on the census family a little bit right now, and also on the household in which the family is born or living, I should say. I'm just bringing up something to show you. Sharing my screen. Okay, this is a portrait. Statistics Canada calls this a portrait of the sense that it's fixed in time. We're not looking at the family throughout time. We're looking at the family at a particular moment of time. And this diagram is from 2017. It represents Canadian households as of 2017, pre-pandemic. As of 2017, we're not necessarily talking about the census family per se, because we're talking about 28% are one-person households, for example. Only 3% are multi-generational household, which is quite a different from other cultural contexts. Multi-generational would mean like children, grandchildren, parents, grandparents sort of thing, all living within one home. You don't see that necessarily so much here. It's shrinking and shrinking, but you certainly see it in other cultural contexts. But what we should know is that things have changed considerably over the years. 9% of all families only have one parent in them. So this photo over here, I guess, is to represent the lone parent family. There's two children, one parent. That's growing. That's a category that's growing. According to this statistic, only 26% of families include a couple with children. Couple doesn't necessarily mean married. It could be married or not married, but they're a couple of some type with children. That's only 26% now. 28%. Oh, I've already said the 28%. What did I miss? Couple without children, 26%. That's a growing category. Okay, the dominant trends are still two-parent families in some respects. Step families are not listed here, I don't think. Or yeah, I suppose they're included in the category here, but they're also fairly large. Just to get a general sense of it, overall, the trend is nonetheless married coupled families are decreasing. That's the trend throughout the years. Married coupled families are decreasing. For example, in 1961, I'm not going to write this, but in 1961, 91.6%, is that right? 91? Could it really be that high? I don't know if I made a typo. Did I mean to put 81 or something? I have 91 written here. I should go back and fact check that because that seems exceedingly high. That's the point, though. It doesn't matter what the exact number is. What matters is the fact that it's really high, right? 91.6% of census families were composed of married couples with children in 1961. So let's say a disproportionately high category of families, census families, were married couples with children. By 2011, which is 10 years ago, it's quite a while ago, that number declined to 67%. Obvious trend change here. I know we've already kind of talked about trends in this way, but it's only continued to decline. Common law couples, relatively recent invention in the history of Canadian, let's say, legal system, to keep it simple. Common law couples have grown to increase married couples. There's more, common law as a category has increased throughout the years. It became one of the fastest growing categories of family, common law, while the married family system is decreasing. For example, it has grown, common law families have grown by 345% over 30 years. That is significant. Lone parenting family has increased. It's more than doubled. I'm feeling that, and I am really feeling it. I don't know how many of you out there are feeling it. I presume there's more than a few of you. Wow, it's hard when you're working during the pandemic and also doing all this other stuff for your child and stuff like that. It's really hard. So I feel for you folks. That's increased. It's more than doubled. Families have become smaller with fewer children, fewer parents, as well as fewer children. And in some cases, there's no census family at all. It's one person. For example, the share of those who are not in a census family has more than doubled to 17% in 2011. I would expect, I haven't checked, I could go and check very quickly, but I'm not going to waste your time and do that. The idea is it's an upward trend. So that's just to give you a sense of the Canadian trends, okay? But let's return to a point I was trying to make before turning to some of this empirical stuff. And that's to discuss the family as a life strategy. The word is from Zygmunt Bauman, remember. Family is a life strategy. Dig into Bowman's claim that the family is one of society's many institutions dedicated to the life strategy of dealing with death, death, avoiding suffering, and so on. Obviously, an abstract sociological theory, and it yet, as of yet, doesn't seem to have any real practical consequences or practical details that we can focus on, and yet it does. The fact is that marriage, let's begin by just saying marriage within the context of a family, marriage as a social institution is an indicator of well-being. This is kind of common knowledge. Marriage is a sociological indicator of well-being. This has been kind of, we might want to, so this approach that I'm giving you today, this evidence that I'm going to start to dig into right now, we would want to update it. And that's indeed what we've been trying to do. Let's just put it out there for now and then say, well, later, what has changed here? Is marriage still an indicator of well-being? For a very long time, we would say it has been. Is it the case that it still is? So I'm going to leave that question open. It may be. But the fact is that marriage is an indicator of well-being, which means it's a life strategy against death. Sociological research has demonstrated that those who are married, particularly men, excuse me, I wish I muted it right in time. I apologize. I'm losing my voice. I've been lecturing. This is 9 hours of lecturing today. Sociological research has demonstrated that those who are married, particularly men, tend to benefit in terms of well-being, in terms of health outcomes. Men have, I'm not going to write this, but if you were taking notes here, this might be something you might want to take down. I'm monitoring the time, and I feel like I got to bring it to a close soon. Otherwise, I'd be typing these notes out for you right here. Men have a lower mortality when compared to those who are divorced, single, separated, or widowed. The married have a higher well-being, especially in terms of mortality. Those who are not married, again, particularly men, seem to have higher levels of depression, of anxiety, and not just psychological distress, but their physical health also suffers. So they have higher reports of disabilities, of chronic conditions, and so on. There's all kinds of reasons why. If we got to kind of think abstractly, but once we think abstractly, we're like, oh, that makes sense. Let's look a bit more closely. Mortality rates are 250% higher for non-married men and 50% higher for non-married women. This was in the 1990s. Again, we might want to see how that has changed over the years. But, I was looking at recently a 2018 study that showed, so this is just 2 years ago, almost 3 years ago sort of thing, that found that single parent fathers have the highest mortality rates. I see some challenges to this among the widowed, I would say. I might want to compare widows, but let's just bracket that for the moment. Single parent fathers have the highest mortality rates. It's obvious, I think, that a behavioral component is central. For example, lung cancer, suicide, injuries or death due to accidents are among the various causes of death among the non-married. People, I would intuit, I don't have evidence of this, I would intuit people tend to smoke more if they're not married because it's on them. Death rates are very high, again, perhaps the highest among those who are widowed. And usually the death rates are really close to the time period at which they lost their partner, their husband or wife or whomever. The mortality tends to spike just after that for any number of reasons. A key takeaway point here is that marriage seems to protect men against death more than it does women, but women still have some health benefits here. It seems, at least according to this article, that everybody kind of benefits from marriage and from family, children and the parents. In the midst of talking about all of this, I realized I never even got to dig into discussing work at all yet, really, and it's somewhat regrettable because I realize how much time I've spent just on the health part. So I should at least say a few things very quickly about the world of work, and then I'll close it. Okay. What in the midst of this can we say about the work-family balance? Well, if the family is a social system that's designed as a life strategy, as I've been saying, then what of the world of work? Well, we can take a perspective on work organizations as spaces where a certain preservation of these life strategies must be maintained, almost as if it's a demand. And in fact, evidence suggests that it is a demand. Families, workers within families, and increasingly we see that it's multiple, of course, genders and roles within the family, are demanding in the workforce, in the labor force, are demanding more accommodations for the family as a life strategy. It's clear that today workers need the assurance of knowing that they can take care of their families before they'll even accept a position of employment at a particular organization or workplace. And employers, in response to these demands, are increasingly in the position of having to offer something by way of this demand. For example, they might offer various forms of childcare or family assistance, and there's all kinds of family-related benefits in the form of insurance or in-house childcare or scheduling flexibility. Scheduling flexibility is a huge one, which could be installed as an incentive to lure in workers. So what ultimately is the employer after from their employee? They're ultimately after some sort of a reliable investment into their commodity. Their commodity is you as a worker. Your labor power is a commodity for them upon which they extract some sort of profit, of course. They want their workers to be trustworthy, to be reliable. And from an employer's perspective, I haven't been writing any of this, I apologize. The biggest issue that they have to deal with, or one of the major issues, I should say, to qualify that, is absenteeism. I hope I spelled that right. Absenteeism it has something to do with the reliability of an employee. But surveys demonstrate that in the American context, and here I'm talking specifically about the United States, surveys demonstrate that a significant amount of absenteeism is associated with issues having to do with such things as, I think I'll just list two. Childcare. This is especially true of single working mothers. And the surveys also seem to suggest, I feel like I'm on the Family Feud survey, says family health is another reason that's popularly cited. The second biggest. The biggest is childcare, then family health, looking after a family member or even yourself. So health in the family seems to be another reason cited as to why there's a lot of absenteeism and hence the termination of employment in many cases. So healthiness of the work-family system, of the work-family balance, depends upon employers opening up new avenues to think about the family. One particular perspective from this week's readings is that absenteeism and maintaining the health or the integrity of the work-family balance could be mitigated to some considerable extent by thinking in terms of a work-family culture. When we think in terms of a work-family culture, what we're talking about, and I'm quoting the article here, are a set of shared assumptions, beliefs, and values regarding the extent to which an organization supports and values the integration of employees' work and family lives. It's to the benefit ultimately of the employers, much more than the families, that they build this into their understanding. A work-family culture is a way of assessing whether these shared assumptions um, about the family and about the work balance. It's an assessment of whether these assumptions are producing a work environment that is beneficial to family health or not beneficial to family health. So with this in mind, we can assess relatively good or poor, relatively healthy or unhealthy work-family cultures within various organizations. What would be the work-family culture of Nipissing University or your place of employment, for example? What are the shared assumptions that are there between you and your employer? A good work-family culture, a healthy one, might be one that, and I'm going to quote here, one in which, quote, the overarching philosophy or belief structure in the organization mostly is sensitive to the family needs of its employees and is supportive of employees who are combining paid work and family roles, end quote. And it can happen in any number of ways, which could help relieve absenteeism, but also help the health of the family more generally by integrating the work and the family systems in a way that's more holistic. So increasingly, work organizations are forced into attempting to manage this conflict between work and family lives by offering flexible scheduling, family insurance plans, and so on. We can get some evidence of a positive work-family culture, claims the author of one of the chapters for this week, simply by looking at policies or programs that are in effect. And the author calls these artifacts. They are artifacts of a good work-family culture if there's policies in place to deal with family issues. So you might want to look, because if these artifacts exist, then they no doubt demonstrate what the author calls the intentions to be supportive of the family and the health of the family and the integrity of the family. Another way we can think about it is in terms of work-family culture be within an organization being composed of three parts or domains. And I think I'm probably going to stop after this. We could look at organizational time demands. You want to assess the work-family culture, say, okay, well, what are the demands from your employer? How much time does it demand? How do you perceive its demands? I would admit, as a professor at Nipissing University, I'm not trying to complain. I'm really privileged and lucky to be here. I really love it. But I feel right now there's a heck of a lot of demands upon me, and I'm finding it difficult to look after my child while I'm lecturing and dealing with all these various moving pieces. But that's as much to do with the pandemic than it has to do with much of anything else. I mean, I think everybody's going through that right now to some extent. But what are these demands? Now, I've given you an example. Maybe you can think about it if you're working. What do you feel disproportionately burdened by demands? And are those demands making it difficult to meet the demands of your own family? Are you working long hours like I am right now? It's late at night as I record this. Are you prioritizing your work life over your family life, and so on? That's a sort of rubric for assessing the first part of a work-family culture. The second would be, what are the career consequences for using work-family benefits, or I should just say family benefits, perhaps? Like, for example, there's some organizational contexts within which people feel as though if they take time off for their family, maybe they're having a child or something like that, if they take time off, maybe it will negatively impact their future career advancement. Some people have that perception. Does that perception exist within the organization? That could be a mode of assessing the work-family culture. Not just are these programs in place, but what are the perceptions of actually taking advantage of them? Sometimes they feel simply symbolic, and yet there's a sort of hidden, unspoken thing, like if you actually take advantage of this, we might not like you so much, or something like that. Number 3, and this is the last one. What is the level of managerial support? I'm not sure managerial is the best word, but what is the managerial support? The author claims that this might be the most important part of this rubric, because our managers, our bosses, those who are somehow looking over our work and assessing it in some way, and perhaps we're in interactions with them more regularly, do they seem sensitive to our family needs? Are they accommodating us in this way? A supportive manager or boss might be one who, I'm quoting the author, believes that handling family issues is a legitimate part of their role, is knowledgeable about company policies, flexible when family problems arise, and handles work-family problems quite fairly, end quote. I'm going to give you an example. I don't want to stir stuff up here too much, but just juxtaposing my last 2 positions. I was an associate professor and chair of a university in 2 programs of a university in India, and I once had to cut time because something came up with my son, and it was handled so gracefully. I had a quick phone call with the dean, and it was like super cool. I felt very much appreciated, and like my family mattered there. Let's switch. And this is in the context of the pandemic. Let's switch here. Admitting we're in the context of a pandemic and we have to be really serious here. I have a child and I cannot find childcare. Now, some of you maybe try and relate to this. Trying to find childcare while I'm trying to do my work is impossible. I haven't been able to find childcare. I've been called upon several times to go to the university. Once I tried to enter the library. They would not let me in because I have my son with me. Now, during the time of the pandemic, he's not an immediate employee of the university or a student. He's not allowed in. Therefore, I cannot go in. So I wasn't able to go in and get some research documents that I needed. I was turned away. They turned it into a big thing. It went up several levels of the administration. I think the head of the libraries ended up writing to me. And again, I'm not pointing fingers at everybody. This is the policy. I understand it. I'm just saying, as a father, it was very difficult to do my research, and I was turned away from the university. Another time, I was called to go test some equipment for one of my classes that I was going to do live on campus. I couldn't find childcare because of the pandemic. They wouldn't let me in. I had to cancel. And then it happened again. And then finally, I was able to go while my son was in school. So he was in school. I was able to go test the equipment, then come back, pick him up from school. Now, it's a serious problem when we can't seem to sort of figure this stuff out. Now, I'm in a situation, and maybe some of you can relate to it. And this is purely in the context of giving an example here of this. I'm not trying to grind any axes. I certainly am not interested in pursuing any of this. It's just to give you an example. My son is now out of school because of the pandemic. Now, there's a chance that I might have to go start teaching live while he will not be in school. See, a lot of moving pieces, in which case I won't be able to teach unless I can find childcare, which means a lot of students are affected. So this is the sort of stuff. It's a rubric of the work-family culture, and it's a good way to assess if it's a positive one, a negative one, or what the gradation is. And you might want to, in your own life, just sort of anecdotally try and reflect upon it the way that I just tried to do for you. It leads to a discussion of the climate of the workplace. Is it such that you can even talk about these things? I certainly didn't have a venue to talk about this sort of stuff. I don't even know if one exists, and maybe one does. Can you discuss family concerns? What is the climate there at your organization? Is it warm? Can you talk about it such that you can talk about issues cross-cutting the family and the workplace? So that gives us a sense of the work-family culture. And I'll just close by saying that there's a growing expectation that workplaces should operate across these three domains. The author concludes with this, I'm quoting, research suggests that a supportive work-family culture is related to important organizational outcomes such as increased commitment, higher job satisfaction, lower absenteeism, less work-family conflict, less psychological distress, fewer somatic complaints having to do with the body as well, and less role strain. Role strain being that concept that we talked about before in terms of how we can perform our roles within a symbolic interactionist sort of perspective. And all of this, of course, that's the end of the quote, all of this, of course, is related to much more positive health outcomes for families, but also for the workplace and for the entire ecosystem of the work-family systems mutually combined. I hope you're all doing well, and I so much appreciate you taking this class with me, and those of you who have been emailing me and trying to stay linked into the class in one way or another. I very much admire your courage to be able to navigate this mess of the pandemic that we're all in so gracefully. Know that I'm here for you if you need anything. If you need to email me, to have a video chat with me, to have a phone call with me about anything having to do with the course or anything even just marginally relating to the course, I'm absolutely here for you despite our mutual busy schedules. All right, you will see me again soon. Bye-bye.